Hi there, my friend. I want to thank RG175 for sponsoring this episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. Great schools thrive under great leadership. At RG175, we understand that finding the right match between a school and its next leader is a defining moment for both heads and trustees. With extensive experience in independent school leadership and a highly personalized approach, we guide boards through thoughtful search processes and support school leaders through key career transitions. Whether you're looking for your next leadership opportunity or seeking the ideal fit for your school, RG175 is here to help. Visit rg175.com. Again, that's rg175.com to learn more, because behind every successful school is a great leader. Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. I am thrilled to be joined by Jason Kern. He's the Senior Innovation and Operations Strategist at Mission and Data. Good friends over there at Mission and Data. They've done amazing work with schools all over the country. Jason and I have kind of really bonded over this question of systems in schools. Jason's been doing this work for a long time. He's helping lots of schools with this. Obviously, it's something that I'm pretty passionate about too. And so we're going to have a kind of a general conversation about why do systems matter and where is the opportunity in front of schools. But before we do that, Jason, welcome to the podcast.
I'm so excited to be here, Peter. Thanks for having me on.
Anytime, my friend. Hey, before we get going, if folks haven't met you or maybe they're not familiar with Mission Data, can you introduce both?
Yeah. So Mission and Data is aptly named by our co-founders, Ari Betoff and Kelsey Broman, because we believe that schools should be driven by your missions, but informed by data. And that works anyway from data visualization of your enrollment data, your financial data, your fundraising data, how you communicate with your board, to consulting in financial sustainability and strategic planning and accountability planning, which we'll talk about, and head comp, faculty comp, just a wide range of independent school needs, as we are a bunch of former independent school and association educators. So we love helping schools be more data informed and using data to make, data informed decisions across your whole school. But I'm excited to talk today about systems because I like to say I'm your typical independent school educator. I always say I was a lower school teacher, I was a middle school teacher, I was an upper school teacher, I was a middle school coach, I was a JV coach, I was a varsity coach, I was director of technology, I was a director of modern learning, I was a chief information officer, chief innovation officer, and then spent my last 5 years as assistant head of school for innovation and learning. And, as all of us in independent schools have that clause in the contract that says all other duties is assigned by the head of school, I think I might have taken that a little too seriously. Yeah. And I think where I got into systems is just finding problems or not, things that we wanted to make better at schools. And it was like, well, how can we actually make this happen and build a system so it would be scalable and last beyond that one particular thing? I mean, I think so often in schools we have pockets of innovation, but how do we actually build a system to sustain innovation or improvement?
Well, let's start at the very beginning. Like when you think about systems, and if you let me frame it this way. If you were talking to, a faculty member of school, a head of school board member, pick your person, and they're like, Jason, like, I tell me what this means. Like, what do you mean by systems? I'd love to dig in there.
Yeah. And I think probably the easiest way to talking about systems is talking about how I first came across building a system in a specific way, and then learn methodology later that I was like, oh, that's what I was doing. And, it's like, I never realized that why this was successful as a system, because at the time I was just trying to solve a problem. Right. And then when I got into Scrum and I was like, wait a minute, well, that's how we did that. So there's several, I think that one of the biggest things as a technology director is you have to build systems to roll things out and that kind of stuff. So I think that's kind of a niche thing. I also think it's why more heads of school and assistant heads of school should come out of technology than does, because there's nobody in school that deals with the operations sides and the educational side as much as the CIO these days.
Yeah.
So I think that's a real opportunity. But I would say the most practical one was when Mike Cobb, who I worked with for over 25 years, became the admissions director at Oak Ridge when we were working there. And we were trying to turn around enrollment, and we really wanted to sit down and say, okay, how are our candidates moving from inquiry to getting online, on campus, to application, all the way through the process. And so we actually sat down and said, okay, well, we need some kind of system when somebody comes into an inquiry. Like, how do we know whether they're really a viable inquiry or not? We get this touch point. And so we were like, we need to assign them a number. So we assigned them a 3. They came in as a 3. And then if they got on campus, they became a 2. And then if we got them to apply, they became a 1. And then they just became part of the application process. But if we came in as a 3 and we contacted them a couple times and we couldn't get in touch with them, they became a 4. And so we could prioritize which of those inquiries really to emphasize. And what we learned through this process is what a lot of schools have come to the conclusion of: inquiries really isn't the most important part. It's what we called pipeline, which was like, we know if we get them on campus, which we called pipeline, now 78% of those we were yielding as enrolls. And so we were like, okay, so we know now where to focus. How can we focus getting them from 3 to 2? And then how can we move them along? We put it in, and we were using senior systems at the time. So we put it in as a custom field inside senior systems, but then we actually had a physical board where we actually had little markers, and, they were basically strips of paper laminated, and we would move them through the process, and we'd mark where they were. And we had
like
a whole
draft board or something.
I had exactly like a draft board.
Yeah.
And what I discovered when I started doing studying Scrum, when we got to All Saints, is that basically we built a backlog. We built sprints to action. We built, the whole process of, like you talk about with 90-day, what are my 90-day goals? What are my 10-day goals? Like, where are we in this process? But it was just out of a need of improving an area of the school. And then I reflected on my career. I was like, I did this in so many different ways. Like, how did I build a system to roll out an educational technology tool?
Right.
We built a similar system. So, but codifying that and putting it into an actual plan and changing your meeting structure to be more efficient around those systems is a huge improvement, and you can get a lot more things done in schools.
Yeah. Over the years, because you were in schools, I was serving outside of schools, right? So kind of coming at it from 2 different perspectives. I did a ton of work around change management, and how do you approach that? How do you approach? I love how you use the example of technology, right? Like, if you're going to do, and I'm sure you've probably done a couple of these over your career, but like, if you're going to put in a new student information system, that literally impacts every single person on campus. In some major ways and minor ways, but it requires a lot of change. So thinking systematically about how do you roll out that change is such a common use case. And, that every school, I think, can kind of get their head around, like, oh yeah, like that's always a real challenge for our school.
Yeah. I mean, imagine bringing on a new admission system, right? And it is the funnel that begins everything that goes into your SIS and then into your development. And if you don't systematically think about, okay, what decisions am I making when I input that initial candidate in, that then has stumble effect all the way down. And if I don't build a system and I don't think about, things like unique identifiers or data integrity, what are the implications down the road? And that's a very technical thing. And I think that's why some people think about systems and they're like, oh, that's very specific to this thing.
Right.
But that's why I love using the admissions example. I'm like, these are just people that were on slips of paper, but there needed to be a system of how do I deal with 300 inquiries if really only 100 of those are really viable inquiries and I'm spending all my time on 300 instead of 100.
Right. And if you look at higher ed, they have all these kind of algorithmic based tools that will do that stuff for you automatically. And it's been a few years since I've been working with admission systems in K-12. So maybe that has percolated up. I have no idea. But I get it. Like, you still have to do that work, right? You have to figure out a system in order to take your limited capacity in the office and deploy it in the best possible way to return the best possible value on that time. And I love how you describe. I literally, I can just see the draft board kind of like laying out in front of me right now. Hey, let's take another example. So you and I both are very interested in this question of systems to support strategic plans. And I've had conversations with heads of school, and it seems like that is a real challenge for independent schools, because now you've got this global plan that impacts all these different areas of the school, and some of it is high stakes, right? Like, some of it is very, very high stakes. So it's a question of a couple of things. One, it's kind of getting the buy-in across the school, which hopefully you've done through the strategic planning process and all that work. But then it's a question of executing and systematically executing it. And so, like, I know this is like a really popular topic for heads. I did this school operating system webinar and was kind of surprised by the number of people who signed up for it. So it tells me that it's an issue. When you do that work, like, how do you think about it? I'd love to kind of break that down at a high level.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of this is you come up with these really aspirational, beautiful to the outside strategic plans, which is what it should be. It should be an aspirational plan that's kind of telling you it shouldn't be a checklist of things to do. But in order to actually make that happen, you need to, in my opinion, you need to break that down into actionable, you know, sprints, rocks, whatever you want to call the terminology is that breaks down into a time capsule, right? And so what we really think about is a responsibility framework, because even when we were doing some of our best work at All Saints using Scrum and some of the other things, you get into a room and it'd be like, okay, here's this topic that we've decided, this strategic initiative that we've decided is important. We've got multiple people that are working on it, because very few things in a strategic plan fall to one person. Right. And it became this, well, I think Peter was doing some stuff, and I think that Mike was doing, and it became the Spider-Man meme where everybody was pointing at each other, right? And so the first thing we really did was say, okay, we've got to find a way to define a responsibility matrix. And so we took Harvard Business Review's RACI, accountable consultant form. We tweaked it a little bit for schools, and we said that the head's accountable to the board and the community for everything that happens, but they can't lead everything. So we need to have an actual leader for each one of these initiatives, but they may not even be the person that's doing the work. There's collaborators all over. We often use retention as the example of this. Who is responsible for retention on campus? Hope every school says everybody on campus, from the first person that walks in to the teachers all the way through. But there's somebody that needs to lead that initiative. Somebody's got to call the meeting. Somebody's got to gather the information. Somebody's got to update on that. And so really defining that leader, and then who are they collaborating with, curating information from, and then how do you inform whoever you need to. And so that structure was really important for us to start with.
I'm curious, and like, we're talking about executing strategy as if it's only a problem for K-12 independent schools. This is a problem for, like, pick your business, pick your industry. This is prevalent throughout all of these areas. Why do you think that is? Like, why do you think it's so hard to take those initial steps to doing that strategic execution? I'm curious.
I mean, to me, like, a lot of people love coming up with strategy. They love to think about the big ideas. Oh, well, this is what we should do. This is how we should do it. We need to increase our ROI. We need to increase the number of our customers. That's happens in every single organization. You can identify the problem, and you might even be able to identify a strategy for the solution. But then the rubber hits the road, and you actually got to do that outside of the urgent that happens day to day.
Yeah.
And so we know the urgent overtakes the strategic every time if you don't have a system to identify check-ins for the strategic.
Do you think it's also, do you think it comes down to a question of getting very sharp with with how you prioritize things? Like, are we trying to do too much too fast?
So this is one of the things that I struggle with, this question that schools ask me, like, how many priorities should we have in a year? How many XYZ should we have in a year? Right. I'm like, well, what is your bandwidth? Every school is different, right? I worked in schools where I had 70 different responsibilities because it was a small school. And I was like, well, I can't lead initiatives in all these areas.
Right.
And then other schools are big enough where you're like, this is just part of that person's job. So I always say, how much of this is part of that person's job?
Yeah.
And then how much of it is a truly add-on? Because I don't think that you should be able to have more than one add-on a year that you're leading. Because I don't know how you're going to do the rest of your job.
What do you recommend? This gets into a topic that, I've chatted with lots of people about. Independent schools are really good at adding things, not so great at retiring things. Um, how do you balance that? Like, I'm curious. Let's dig into that. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, so there's two elements to that to me. There's the moving something from what I would refer to as strategic into operational. So, hey, we need to do a curriculum review as a strategic. I need to look at this particular department's vertical alignment, or I need to build some kind of system where we're continually reviewing our curriculum because we don't have one. Okay, that's a strategic initiative. Once I've actually gotten a system, that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop doing that. It just means I've operationalized that, right? And so that to me is like it's moved out of strategic into operational. And then there's other things that are like, okay, we've been doing this particular thing for 50 years and it no longer makes sense. We need to sunset that program. And that's a much harder discussion of like, okay, why? It gets into change management, right? Anytime that you sunset something, somebody feels like they've lost something,
Right.
because I've changed it. And so I need to assess the why behind it. I go back to Simon Sinek. Why are we sunsetting this program? Why is this no longer serving our community? And if I can come up with a great why, well, then I need to just, disseminate that information and get people on board. And I need to sunset it in a non immediate way.
Yeah, this reminds me of a very early episode that I did in this series with Ari and Autumn Graves from St. Anne's Belfield, and she talks about how how her school gets in this cycle of reviewing programs on campus. It could be the most entrenched program at the school, but you still need to go through and review it and audit it and determine like how do you make it better, or should you be iterating in another direction, or do you retire a program if it's not performing as you'd hoped? And one thing I've talked about with members in my community is like there's a very simple exercise that you can do, which I think gets to your why, but then it measures it against the data, right? So if you think about all of your programs, I forget what it's called, statement of activities, maybe that's what it is in your filings. And you've got your revenue, your expenses, but then you need to add another column, which is impact to mission. Because you may have a program that generates no revenue, it costs a fortune, but it's like pinned to the top of impact to mission. Well, that's great. You don't want to that's a keeper. But then you may have a program that's low revenue, high expense, has very little impact on mission. And I think that's one that you circle and you have some conversations around to determine, is this something that we should continue to do?
Yeah, I think having some kind of analysis of impact to mission or impact to strategic plan or values, and really looking at that. One of the things that we did when we got to All Saints was a space audit, and we did a space audit not on how many times is this used. Like a lot of people do space audits and they say, oh, okay, this classroom is used 6 times a day for yada, 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 right? We did a space audit on does this space impact student learning? So we went to every space in the building and looked at to the day and said, what is the impact on student learning? in this space, because that is really what we were concerned about. And so the boardroom, like, how much was the boardroom impacting student learning? We can argue that there's a place where you're making decisions and therefore it's a big thing, or I'm bringing donors in. There's just a lot of arguments. For us, it was like, the space really is that we use it for board meetings and we use it for PA meetings or whatever it is, but we can do those anywhere. And actually having board meetings all across the campus probably is a better idea than bringing them in one room every day. And that boardroom became our Fab Lab, which had huge student learning. So that went from basically like a 1 to a 10, and, a 9. And it was like, okay, but who would ever think of taking away, but without that matrix, some kind of matrix that says, whatever I'm trying to value, let's make sure that we're measuring against that value, to your point of, cost. It's like a three-legged stool, like any other three-legged stool. But if impact to mission, impact strategy is not part of your matrix, you really need to reconsider your matrix.
And what I'm hearing here is that when you say systems is like a general catch-all for all these things, but there are a lot of layers to it, but they have to be intentionally layered on top of each other.
I think the intention's the whole piece of this, right? Is, are you making decisions because that's how you've always made decisions, or based on the same factors over and over again? Or are you having generative conversations about these things? And the other thing that we did that kind of you made me think of is, we would do an OODA loop, what we called an OODA loop, again from Scrum, but this review of every big activity. So to your point of, Ari and Autumn talking about the matrix and how they did it, we would do every year, what was the cost of this? What was the revenue of this? What was the impact of this? How did it result in what we were looking for? And we had a document that every year, okay, remember at the beginning of the year when we're going to do the gala next year, we said that we didn't want to do these things again. And we wanted to focus on these things again, because you don't think about that for a year from when you were planning that last time. And then you just kind of forget about it because, again, the urgent just comes up. Hey, we got to do X, Y, Z. And you're like, okay, I've got an OODA loop. If I've got that review document, I can look at it and say, okay, this is what we said last time. This is what we said we were going to improve. And if you're not improving on programs, even if they're programs that have lasted for 50 years, then how are you making the school better?
And this is, to me, is where like the rubber hits the road in your leadership meetings, right? Is being intentional about designing meetings that obviously are dealing with the day-to-day, but make space for the strategic as well. And, I teach a methodology. I'm sure you have a methodology as well, but it feels like whenever I'm talking to a school about why an operating system is so critical and the impact they can have, I said, look, great. We're going to take your vision. We're going to break it down into a 3-year, a 1 year. We're going to figure out what your 90-day sprints are. We're going to look at your organizational chart to make sure it's going to where you want it to be. But the most impactful thing that you can do as a leader is facilitate a very structured meeting geared towards those strategic initiatives. Like, from your perspective, you've been working with a lot of schools. Does that resonate with you?
I think so much of this is being intentional, back to that, of your meeting structure, but also having meetings that have the right people in the room. Because sometimes we just have an admin meeting every week and everybody's in that meeting. And so I feel like I have to address everybody in that meeting. And what we believe is that if somebody doesn't walk away from a meeting with an action item or informed on something, then they shouldn't have been in the meeting. And being more intentional about the purpose of meetings, and who should be in the room, and being okay that sometimes a senior administrator isn't in the room because they're not going to have a meaningful part of that discussion is okay.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And it's funny, a little story. So I was at Case NACE this, I guess, when was that, January or something like that. And I was doing this presentation there, and it was really cool. I had a great crowd, and I flashed up this slide around how do you run a 90-minute meeting, and like breaking it down into all the components, talking about how you manage issues, all the different things. I've never been in, I've given a lot of talks in my career. I've never had so many cell phones pop up and take photos of that slide. And and it makes sense because honestly, for me, Jason, the road to this path was my frustration with my inability to run a good meeting. Like I just felt like I wasn't doing them as well as I should have been doing. And understanding like how can you do them well, it can really transform not only yourself as a leader, obviously it's going to put you in a far better like view from a leadership perspective, but like when you're trying to gain that velocity on these big strategic initiatives that you've invested time, money, energy, all the things, like if you're not focused on that aspect of it, it's boy, what a miss. I mean, to me, that's the low hanging fruit. Like if you're going to do anything systematically, really focus on your meetings.
I think we've all been in what I would call the justify your job meeting, where we sit down in a meeting and we go around the table and say, okay, give your updates. And it's like,
Worst meeting, the worst.
Yes, it's the worst meeting, right? But it is the meeting where we feel like in some way that we have to be informed, right? And I think that's the other piece of this is how do you build some kind of structure that allows you to keep people informed? We always talk about KPIs and, key performance indicators. Some schools are allergic to key performance indicators. And I always say KPIs are just keep people informed. How are you keeping people informed on these strategic initiatives? Because they don't need to sit in a meeting and just hear what I'm doing if it doesn't involve them, but they do need to be informed about it. So how do I build a structure or a dashboard or whatever it is that allows people to be informed? It's just like a board meeting, right? If you're not using a consent agenda in your board meeting, then you're wasting a lot of time just reviewing things that people could read.
Right. 100%. And, people sitting around that boardroom, bring a lot of expertise. You don't want to report out being the way you utilize their expertise. Yeah.
And I think that some heads of school have come to that realization with a consent agenda for the board. But then when they think about their leadership team meeting, they don't use a consent agenda type of structure for that.
Yeah. And I think it makes sense to me because like when you think about your training throughout your career, whether it's, the academic leadership, enrollment leadership in general, I would be hard. So I asked this question actually when I was doing that case NACE. I probably had 120 people in the room. And I said, hey, how many of you have actually been taught how to run a meeting in your career? And it was a very small sample of folks who raised their hand. And because I was never taught. Were you taught? I mean, I had to kind of figure this out on my own.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's not part of academic leadership in most places to think about how do you build a team? How do you make that team efficient? How do you run a meeting? How do you use your time, energy, and money, right? I always think about where are your time, energy, and money? If I walk into a school and I look at their time, energy, and money, and I will see how they're utilizing that, does that reflect what they think is important?
Right.
And so if I have a strategic plan, and then I look at how you hold meetings, your time, energy, and money in that meetings, I can tell you whether your strategic plan is important or not, or if it was just something that you did. Because if you don't have a structure to make it happen, then you check the box, and maybe some people are doing it, but it's not important to you as an organization.
Yeah, or they just don't know there's another way.
And I guess I'm a little harsh in the thing. I mean, they could want to do that, but ultimately it's not important to you, right? I mean, just because if you don't know a better way, then I hope that you're seeking out a better way to do it. Now, I do think that there are elements where you can be much more efficient. Like you can be intentional, and then you can get with somebody like you that has been studying a system and put in a system place that you can go from good to great. But there are some places where we know where a strategic plan becomes this really pretty coffee table book, right?
Yeah.
And there's a difference between the two. I don't think that there's I don't think there's anybody in schools that is not well-intentioned. I mean, that's one of the beauties of working with schools.
100%.
Everybody there that they want the place to be better.
Yeah.
It's just, do we have a shared understanding of how do we make the place better? Instead of like, I know how to make my admissions department better. I know how to make my AP calculus class better, but do I know how to make the school better? That's a totally different discussion.
Yeah. And again, I just need to reiterate, like school people shouldn't think, oh, this is just so specific to our industry. I mean, it is all over the place,
Yep.
right? It's just, but I think that now there's more. I don't know. I don't want to say research because, maybe research is the right word, but there's just more I think there's increasing understanding of like, that's the low hanging fruit is if you can put good solid systems in place, you do increase your ability you increase your ability to do more, but do more against the things that matter the most. And I just feel look, Jason, I mean, you and I both talked to a lot of heads of school. The pressure that they're under is immense. It's incredible the pressure that they're under. And if they can build out new tools in order to manage that pressure in a more manageable way than say, what they're doing today, like that's the low hanging fruit in my mind.
Well, and if you're a head of school, well, being a head of school right now is one of the most difficult jobs out there in any industry, I'll argue. Um, but B, also helping heads of school understand that you can't do all this by yourself and you have to distribute leadership, and you can't distribute leadership without a good system, because then you just build more pockets of isolation within your school. And so having a system that helps you distribute leadership and build a shared understanding of what success looks like and how we're all being clear in our expectations with each other. Because as we talked about, every senior leader in a school is there because they want what's best for the kids and what's best for the school. I firmly believe that. I firmly believe that there aren't people that go into this just to make a ton of money, because, to be honest, you're not going to make a ton of money doing this. But if we don't have a shared understanding of what success looks like, we're going to be sprinting off in different directions. And we're going to come back at the end of the year and say, hey, Peter, look at all this great stuff I did in my area. And you're going to be like, that's great, but that's not what we really were intending. And then everybody's disappointed. Nobody has clarity.
Right? Like that's why silos are so prevalent across organizations of all types. It's that lack of kind of the system that binds everything together. Hey, as we begin to wrap up, I always love to ask my guests this question. So imagine a head of school called you and said, Jason, what you said resonates. Like, I'm feeling a lot of those pressures, but I'm not sure where to start. Like, what would you recommend? Like, what's a simple thing that a head of school can do today that would be helpful in terms of either educating themselves about systems or doing something actionable, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the biggest changes just in my systems understanding was reading the book Scrum, and just how that's set. Because again, there's EOS, there's your school operating system, there's Scrum, there's all of these systems and change management, but they all have a similar ethos. The specifics are different, but this ethos is. So I'm forgetting the EOS book right now. Traction.
Yep.
So Traction, Scrum, just getting a little bit of that. They're quick reads. They give you some high level pieces, and then saying, I always said, when I was a school leader and I went to schools, I stole freely and told people that I stole freely from them. But what was beautiful about it is you can't take somebody else's exact thing into your school and make it happen. You've got to take the ideas of these, put it into your school context, and then make it happen with your leaders. But to me, it's, what are your strategic priorities? Do you have leaders that are assigned, that are responsible for at least pulling that meeting together and informing you along the way? And then do you have some system that has a cadence of informing back to the right constituents, to make sure that there are checkpoints? Because it's like any other classroom, right? If we just have summative assessments at the end of the semester, you're never going to know whether you're on the right path. We got to build formative assessments. We do this in our classrooms every day. We don't do it in our leadership every day in a meaningful way. And so why do we think it's good for a classroom, but not good for our boardroom or our leadership?
Yep, I love it. That's a great way to end it. Jason Kern, Senior Innovation and Operations Strategist at Mission and Data. If somebody wants to reach out, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Kern at missionanddata.com.
There you go, Kern at missiondata.com. All right, my friend, thank you. I really do appreciate it. This has been such a fun conversation. Boy, I think this is going to be helpful, so thank you. Hi there, my friend. I want to thank RG175 for sponsoring this episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. Great schools thrive under great leadership. At RG175, we understand that finding the right match between a school and its next leader is a defining moment for both heads and trustees. With extensive experience in independent school leadership and a highly personalized approach, we guide boards through thoughtful search processes and support school leaders through key career transitions. Whether you're looking for your next leadership opportunity or seeking the ideal fit for your school, RG175 is here to help. Visit rg175.com. Again, that's rg175.com to learn more, because behind every successful school is a great leader.